split the webinar up into 3 sessions. Session 1 will cover an update from Natural England and a take from a national government organisation. Session 2 will cover the 2 different approaches from local planning authorities to biodiversity net gain and offsetting. And in session 3, we will talk to 5 national house builders on how biodiversity net gain is currently working in practice, the sort of challenges and opportunities that it brings, and how it can be embedded into the planning and development process. Unfortunately, we won't have time to engage the viewers in debate within the allocated time, but we welcome and encourage everyone to the housing community's LinkedIn page, where I will be doing a Q&A joined by many of the panelists here. And if the panelists aren't able to join, we will forward on any questions which are relevant to them specifically. So in session 1, first up, we have a government update from Nick White, who's the Principal Advisor for Biodiversity Net Gain in Natural England, who has been progressing biodiversity net gain in government for years, sort of carefully navigating evidence and policy to bring us to where we are today. So thanks for joining, Nick.
Hello. Sorry, my mic was muted for a second. Morning, everyone. So as Jack said, I'm Nick White from Natural England, and just going to give you a quick update on where we are with biodiversity net gain. So next slide, please. So the key opportunity for biodiversity net gain is that for years we know that the development process has led to the routine loss of nature. That's obviously detrimental to wildlife, but it also doesn't benefit you or I either in the kind of benefits that we can get from access to green space, as COVID demonstrated. Biodiversity net gain is a really exciting opportunity to kind of fundamentally change this and to reverse this and to make sure the development process does leave a positive outcome for nature, but also provides benefits for our communities living in and around development. It's something many people on the call will already have come across through local plan requirements that are starting to kind of set out local expectations around biodiversity net gain. But the real game changer, the thing that we're all preparing for, is the forthcoming mandatory approach to net gain. So next slide, please. So when the Environment Act achieved royal assent in November last year, one of the key components of it was this kind of forthcoming requirement for a mandatory approach to biodiversity net gain for development projects in England. So it covers England only. It applies to developments included in the Town and Country Planning Act, as well as to nationally significant infrastructure projects. So those are those covered by the 2008 Planning Act, and requires this minimum 10% net gain calculated by using a standardized biodiversity metric that would need to be submitted alongside with a kind of net gain plan as well. The net gain requirement is that habitats are managed and maintained for at least 30 years, and it can be delivered either on site by integrating it into the kind of red line boundary through green infrastructure, for example, or landscaping. It can be delivered off site through a wider market of local landowners, farmers, NGOs, possibly developers, other sites, or ultimately as a last resort through the purchase of government statutory biodiversity credits. Any gains that are delivered off site will need to go onto a national register. And importantly, the Act has passed. The requirement hasn't yet started. There's a 2-year transition period. We're now at the halfway point. So it's going to come into force for Town and Country Planning Acts, most likely in November of next year, and then by late 2025 for nationally significant infrastructure projects. To stress, it doesn't change existing protections. It's a new requirement. Next slide, please. So one of the things we don't yet know is some of the detail around this. So there were 2 important consultations held this year. One was a policy consultation that ran at the start of the year, which talked about should there be any exemptions to the net gain requirement. They're likely to be limited. The detail of how it will apply to NSIPs, how the process for kind of registering sites on this national register, and also about the interaction between biodiversity net gain and other environmental payment schemes, such as ELM or carbon credits, etc. The politics of the summer kind of impacted the government's response to this. So we're now expecting a response probably by January of next year. So watch out for that. There's also a consultation on the metric as well. So what's going to become this statutory biodiversity metric? So at the moment, we've got a biodiversity metric that's published called version 3.1, and there's also a simplified version of that, the small sites metric. And the proposal was that both of those should be form the basis of what becomes this statutory metric that the Secretary of State will publish. Again, there was a consultation this time over the summer, and again, we're expecting a response to that consultation from government in probably January of next year, with the final kind of statutory metric published about a month after that. So kind of late February, early March on that one. So final slide, please. So we are in the process of this countdown period. Mandatory net gain is coming. So one of the key things is to kind of make sure that organisations, be they planning authorities, developers, landowners, etc., all kind of prepared and ready for this. So for developers, the easiest way to achieve net gain is by early consideration of it. And that means at site selection stage, if you've got opportunities to kind of choose between sites, which site has the lower kind of biodiversity value, but also from really early kind of design conversations that bring together ecologists, landscape architects, engineers to integrate nature into the scheme. If you've got habitats on site and good quality habitats, retain those as far as you can, where you've got opportunities to enhance them as well. That could be a good way of achieving net gain. Projects will also need to factor in are they looking to achieve net gain on site or off site? And there could be good practical reasons as to why it's not possible on site, or equally ecological reasons as to why actually off site is a more sensible way of delivering net gain. So think about how you're looking to deliver it. The more you can deliver local habitat priorities, that's by referencing existing biodiversity action plans or biodiversity opportunity maps, green infrastructure strategies that local authorities have developed, the better. That in the future will become more simplified with the rollout of local nature recovery strategies. And again, they will highlight the areas, the habitat types and locations that people would like to see prioritised for nature, and you'll get rewarded for delivering those. There is existing good practice out there. So there's practice developed by Sirius, SIEM and IEMA as professional bodies. And there is now a British standard, which is a kind of process standard for biodiversity net gain as well, BS 8683. So do refer to that. And then finally, an increasing amount of training is being developed and rolled out through bodies such as the Chartered Institute of Ecologists, Landscape Institute, the RTPI, but also bodies like the Planning Advisory Service and Field Studies Council. So do watch out and refer to those as well. So, do get ready for net gain. It is coming. It's only a year away. That's it for me. I'll hand you back to Jack.
Amazing, thanks, Nick. That's really useful and a really useful insight into sort of peeking behind the curtain of what we're to expect over the next 12 months. I'm really excited, as I'm sure a lot of people on this call are, about the prospect of biodiversity net gain. But like you say, Nick, it's happening now. Local policies are requiring it now, and planning takes a lot longer than people want it to take. And 12 months is not very long in the planning process, so people need to be prepared right now. So next we have Lisa Palfreman, who's the Senior Technical Manager for Environment at Homes England, who's going to give us an insight into another aspect of government's take on biodiversity net gain. It's great to have you here today, Lisa.
Thanks, Jack. And yeah, good morning, everyone. I'm Lisa Palfreman, and along with a colleague, I lead on the Natural Environment Workstream for Homes England. And Homes England is the government's housing and regeneration agency. One of our key activities is de-risking land and bringing it forward for development. So we've got a portfolio of around 9,000 hectares, and that includes some former operational sites from other public sector bodies. And for most of those sites, we look to secure outline planning consent and then sell under a building lease to one of our developer partners. And it's for them then to achieve reserve matters approval and build out the scheme in accordance both with the planning consent and our own conditions. And we also increasingly take on a master developer role on large strategic schemes such as at York Central. So I'm just going to give a very brief outline of how we're preparing for mandatory BNG. And I'd say that while it poses some challenges for us, especially where we've held land for a long time or we've already developed proposals ahead of BNG being introduced locally, there are lots of opportunities as well. So one of the things that was important initially is that we already had some experience of delivering development with biodiversity benefits prior to BNG coming about. So, for example, the Avenue scheme in Chesterfield, it's a former coking works which was remediated over 19 years by Homes England and also by our predecessor bodies. And it's now delivered a new 50-hectare country park as well as a nature reserve, and there are new homes being built there as well. Also, we're delivering off-site biodiversity units for Northstowe in Cambridgeshire. That's on land that was acquired specifically for ecological mitigation back in 2016. And what we found, it's been helpful really to go back to these schemes and sites, talk to the colleagues and consultants that were involved originally in the design and delivery, and make sure we're taking on board lessons learned in preparing for mandatory BNG. And where we can, sharing that intelligence with colleagues and where appropriate, but with other partners too. As we're seeing an increasing number of local authorities having BNG in their plans, we're trying to build up experience really in how it's working on the ground. So at Brookley in West Sussex, where we got outline planning consent in 2019 for a scheme of 3,500 new homes and associated community facilities, we're looking there at delivering 23% BNG against the 10% local requirement. And part of that's helped by the fact that over 40% of the scheme it will be strategic green infrastructure. And where possible, we're looking to start delivering BNG as early as we can. So once an agricultural tenancy ends on part of the site, our estates team start looking after the land, and we're then doing the planned biodiversity improvement works on the parts of the site that will be open space. So things like dealing with scrub encroachment on the higher value grasslands and a more sympathetic hedgerow management regime. So that happens for a short period before it's then sold to a developer partner to take those sites forward. And the early delivery obviously has benefits for nature and people, as well as making sense for us commercially. So we use consultants for the bulk of the technical work, but there are now 2 of us in-house with BNG and ecology expertise. So as well as working to ensure that BNG is part of our development process, we can act as like a first port of call for colleagues and also support them to work through the more complex situations, such as where we need off-site solutions. What we've done for the last 2 years is run an internal BNG survey. So we ask project managers to tell us how they're responding to BNG local requirements for their scheme, how they're addressing mitigation hierarchy, other considerations that help us better understand things such as estimated costs. The most recent survey earlier this year, we identified 38 schemes that were already planning for or delivering BNG, and then we use the survey results to prioritise our support activities. So things like identifying what training needs project managers have. We run a mix of open training sessions and then targeted support as well. Produce a detailed advice note looking at BNG right across the project life cycle, from before acquisition to right through to disposal and long-term stewardship. And a track record document for all the consultants on our technical panels. They've submitted their track record on BNG, and it enables colleagues to sort of select the right company for their scheme if they're looking for specific BNG services. And for several years now, Homes England's used the design quality assessment tool, Building for a Healthy Life. We use it in master planning and as a requirement on the schemes in terms of what we require of our developer partners. And I'd say that nature is really integral to that tool. It talks about having a strong landscape strategy, offering opportunities to reintroduce lost species, the importance of natural connections. And so project managers can submit their scheme designs to a weekly internal surgery of technical leads. And that helps to test how well the scheme designs align with objectives like Building for a Healthy Life and also BNG. One discrete work stream we've had is the review of legacy land that has no potential for traditional development, to see whether there are opportunities to deliver biodiversity units or other environmental benefits. So Arcadis carried out surveys on the sites, 32 sites initially, calculated the BNG uplift that could be possible on those sites, tended to be smaller sites between 1 and 5 hectares. 21 of those sites went on to a second phase of work. So we got some more detailed advice and also costings for the capital works and the maintenance. And we're now looking at how we take those forward. We could use them where we've got nearby Homes England schemes that can't do all their BNG on site to help with the overall BNG score. And I'd say all this activity really is paying off. So BNG seems to be well understood across our development functions, and also to some extent increasingly at senior levels of the organisation. And I'd say with now less than a year to go until the Environment Act takes effect, we've got to really step up some of the activity to make sure we're fully prepared. We're working on a BNG KPI, which we can use in annual reporting and also to monitor progress. And that's part of a wider work stream on sustainability and design, which is becoming an increasing priority for us. So I'd say we've been on quite a learning journey already, and overall, basically, we're seeing BNG as an opportunity to deliver attractive schemes, and it's part of our mission really to make sure we've got high quality placemaking and the kinds of places which support nature and also make great places to live. Okay, that's all from me, so I'll hand back to Jack to introduce the next session.
Amazing, Lisa. It's really sobering to hear you know, a company like Homes England that they're already doing what's required in a way, and you know, it's great to hear that you're using your sort of green space for people and for nature as well, which, you know, is other ecosystem services which aren't really reflected in the metric but are equally important. You know, if the nature we're providing isn't for the people that live there, what's it for? So yeah, no, that's really great, and thanks for that insight. So that concludes session 1, and we'll go straight into session 2, where we'll hear from 2 local planning authorities who are taking sort of slightly different approaches to prepare themselves for mandatory biodiversity net gain, with a slight focus around offsetting. First, we'll hear from Heather Webb, who's the Principal Project Officer for Northamptonshire, who's leading on biodiversity net gain policy for the authority. Thanks for joining us today, Heather, and please tell us what Northamptonshire has been up to.
Well, Northamptonshire, for anybody who isn't sort of aware of the local government reorganisation in the area, Northamptonshire Council is the new unitary formed of the former Wellingborough, Kettering, Corby and East Northamptonshire districts. We've got an officers working group dealing with net gain right now, and we've got a general approach worked out, but there's still a lot of mechanics to deal with. And Northamptonshire Council's position has been informed largely by appeal decisions and the recent DEFRA consultation, which is kind of, we consider to be to indicate the direction of travel. Technically, net gain applies to all applications, but in practice, it's not possible to manage. I'm the only ecologist, and I cover 6/7 of Northamptonshire, so it's just not possible. So until the secondary legislation is in place, it is not being pursued on all applications, but on major and minor developments where a habitat survey would be required, as set out in our biodiversity SPD, which has a checklist to identify when a habitat survey is needed. So this rules out pretty much all householder applications requiring only species surveys, so things like barn conversions for the most part, and then applications on those sites like car parks and some industrial estates where the only existing habitat is hard standing. Any percentage of net gain is currently acceptable because our joint core strategy does not specify a percentage, but obviously the higher the better. And it's worth noting that Northamptonshire is partly in the Oxford to Cambridge arc, which is looking at a 20% minimum once the arc gets going. We do require that net gain is demonstrated using the latest DEFRA metric, so either currently 3.1 or the small sites metric as appropriate, and we don't accept other metrics. When it comes to actually securing the net gain, the planning authority has to be satisfied that the applicant is prepared and able to provide the necessary biodiversity gain and that it will be appropriately managed over time. So if this isn't demonstrated pre-determination, then we consider that any decision to approve would not comply with the Environment Act and PPF and our local plan. And we have had net gain in our local plan since 2015, 2016. In North Northamptonshire, we have 3 options for demonstrating net gain, which have been sort of touched on already. So there's on-site delivery, which we would at present secure via a planning condition. And where that's not possible, and bearing in mind that off-site compensation is supposed to be a last resort under both the MPPF and our local plan. The first option for off-site delivery would be using land within the applicant's control or ownership. So that would be secured through planning obligations, section 106. We're looking into section 39 agreements or conservation covenants. This is still kind of new stuff to our legal folks. So we're looking at exactly what legal mechanisms they recommend to be used for this kind of thing. The other option for offsite delivery is through a third-party provider. So we are fortunate we've got a couple of habitat banks with more coming on board in our area. For predetermination, we expect the applicant to provide the biodiversity information sort of as set out in the consultation. So setting out the number of units required. We also want to see any agreements that have been established with providers. And fundamentally, the key thing is we want to see an understanding of the costs involved in securing those units. The provision would be, I think, secured through a condition. And pre-commencement, the application would need to provide the biodiversity plan that sets out the details of the provider, the legal agreement in place with that provider, and receipt for the purchase of those units. We've got, I think, 3 or 4 habitat banks in the area. They're kind of at varying stages of readiness, but at least 2 are shovel ready. The council is maintaining a list of habitat banks as they come up so that we can provide them to to applicants on request, and it's notable that the Environment Bank currently does not have any sites in Northamptonshire, so the Environment Bank is not an option for us. It's possible where I suppose you would have a net loss on a site near one of the borders, that if somebody were to go over, say, into Cambridgeshire or Leicestershire, that might be considered, but we haven't really had any feedback from members yet on what they are expecting by way of net gain. It's very early days in the Habitat Bank market in our county, but as far as I understand, costs are in the region of about £30,000 to £35,000 per unit. The council is looking into what fees would be needed to cover costs to administer net gain, because there's administration, legal, ecology, and various others. So we don't have a figure, but it is likely to be a flat fee rather than a percentage, because a flat fee is considered just to be easier for everybody and more representative of the work involved. Something that has come up repeatedly from applicants is the idea of commuted sums. So the North Northamptonshire Council cannot accept sums in lieu of net gain. Applicants must secure offsite provision either on other land within their ownership or control or through a habitat bank. The council does not, we're still a new council, and we don't have the means to deliver or demonstrate net gain, and commuted sums are not considered to comply with the planning regs. That's what our advice from our policy and legal folks are. And we've, I've recently had this confirmed at a meeting with Natural England. My understanding is that this will be sort of set out formally in guidance, but where we are offered commuted sums by applicants who do not want to pursue a habitat bank, we are unable to take them. So that's our approach at the moment. We are going to be refining. There are elements of net gain that still do need a lot of refinement. So we'll just continue to work on those until the secondary legislation comes into effect. That's it for me. So back to you, Jack.
Yeah, thanks, Heather. Yeah, really interesting to hear, what you've been up to, and it sounds like you've been thinking for quite some time actually about how this is delivered in practice, and there's so many unknowns, and people will probably get this wrong, from a local authority's perspective and from a developer's perspective, and forums like this where you can knowledge share and understand what other people are doing is the sort of catalyst to bring that inspiration to different people to get the right approach that works for the environment. Just out of interest, how did you come across your offset sites? Your banks, were they volunteered up to you, or did you actively go seeking for them? And who were the main contacts to be able to achieve that?
Yeah, we don't have the resources to go seeking them, but folks have come to us, some land managers and landowners. Yeah, they've come to us. We are maintaining the information on their behalf. So when applicants, agents get in touch with us, we've got this spread, are registered, so they have the contact details. Typically, the site owner or the agent are the okay. Contact people. Yeah.
Okay. That's really good, thanks. Yeah, and it makes sense to have a strategic approach and yeah, keeping sort of tabs on what's going on in the county, but no doubt there'll be lots of things happening that local authorities probably don't know until something lands on their desk for a decision to be made on, and understanding what happens in that situation is probably quite interesting to find out. So next up, we've got Rachel Jones, who's one of my former colleagues actually, from my Natural England days. Good to see you, Rachel, and thanks for joining. Rachel's the Economic Development and Planning Ecology Manager at Wiltshire Council. Tell us how Wiltshire are readying yourselves for mandatory biodiversity net gain.
Great, thank you, Jack. Yes, I'm the Ecology Manager at Wiltshire Council, so I'm just going to give a short update on how we've been preparing for mandatory biodiversity net gain and what we're currently doing at the minute. So just for context, Wiltshire, it's a very large unitary authority in England. We've got a very rural population, lots of designations. We've got nature conservation designations, landscape, cultural heritage, etc. We are very lucky to have an in-house ecology team. We've got 3 full-time equivalent officers working on development management. We have around, I think, 5,000 planning applications a year coming in, although obviously not all go through to ecology. So we do have a team, and we're very lucky with that. We're currently updating our local plan. The existing policy secures no net loss. and consideration also needs to be given to local ecological networks. We ask for enhancement, but there's no set percentage, and we have had recent appeals which have confirmed we can only secure 1%. But what we're doing is we're asking applicants to use the BNG metric, the 3.1 on small sites, to evidence no net loss. And we're finding most sites are achieving around 5% already. We do have some repeat offenders that are at about 50% loss, at least for the initial consultation. And obviously we have to work that through planning because it's not acceptable in policy terms. From a development management perspective, we're finding that extra time and resource is definitely needed to analyse the metric. There's lots of sense checking that's needed and cross-referencing plans. And as we go through the planning process from outline down to full applications, it can get very complicated. I mean, essentially space runs out on site, and obviously the top tips you've had about looking very early in the process and creating space for net gain is really important. We've had a couple of applications which have got to very late stages that cannot evidence no net loss on site. It's been very difficult for officers and for the ecology teams, and there's lots of pressure for solutions. We have secured contributions in a couple of cases via legal agreements to compensate on council-owned land. So Wiltshire's lucky to own some land itself. This has been very recent, but it has allowed us to think about the future process when it comes to net gain. The option always remains for applicants to deliver their own scheme, either on site or with a third-party provider, and they can change their layouts as needed, but we have offered a solution in a couple of cases. The first pilot that we looked at was a council-owned intensive dairy farm, where the opportunity has arisen because of a tenancy moving on out of the area, that we can restore to chalk grassland and create a local nature reserve. So we've appointed the RSPB to look at habitat restoration. So that's our sort of first pilot project. We have got other rural estate, and we have got open space and amenity land. So we're really lucky in that respect. And we've started an evidence-based project to look at other opportunities for biodiversity net gain enhancements. The work's actually going wider than BNG. We're looking at carbon offsetting as well and nutrients. But what this sort of evidence-based framework allows us to do is to look at wider council obligations and the social community side, rural economy, and also to progress it with stakeholders. For all schemes, we'll obviously need to agree the baseline. It will go on the National Register in due course. We're looking more at tenancy agreements and management modifications rather than wholesale sort of farm changes. And we are allocating credits directly to applications, and we're not pooling monies at all. And obviously we'll be registering the sites. We are aware that we haven't got enough land for this to be the only option. We don't want it to be the only option either. We're working with third parties to bring forward schemes across Wiltshire. We're a very big geography, so for us to maintain our ecological networks in line with the local nature recovery strategy, we'll need sites across Wiltshire. So we're pursuing options with third parties as well, and we will probably be doing a call for sites too. So I think the idea of where we want to get to in the next year is to have a range of options across Wiltshire, both using our land and third parties, and just to help almost be as ready as we can be for next November. So thank you very much, Jack. Back over to you. Hope that was helpful.
Really helpful. Thanks, Rachel. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. And yeah, it's like maybe a slightly different approach, trying to use council-owned land to deliver public goods, I guess, and smooth the planning process. I think there'll be a lot of local authorities. I know there's quite a few local authorities which are watching this now, which will probably be following in your footsteps to enable a slightly sort of pincer movement joint approach to that offsetting. So yeah, thanks for sharing that. And I guess also the whole additionality, which is eagerly awaited, the definitions for, which I believe will be published next year with the new metric on how you can sort of stack and bundle these ecosystem services. So yeah, but look forward to that. Okay, so that concludes our session 2 from a local planning authority approach. The next session, we are sort of having a bit of an open panel discussion with a great lineup of developers, national house builders, and the sort of biodiversity and sort of sustainability leads for them on how it's currently being implemented, what the concerns are, where the opportunities and risks lie. So first up, we've got James Scott, who's the Group Director of Strategy and Planning for Urban and Civic, a master planner. My question to you, James, is as an organisation who's been implementing Biodiversity Net Gain since 2006, do you consider Biodiversity Net Gain to be a risk or opportunity for development? And are there any lessons learned which you'd like to share with the rest of the industry?
Absolutely. Thank you very much indeed for giving us the opportunity to listen to all of that that's just gone before and then set out a few bits and pieces from the industry perspective. Firstly, just in the context, so Urban and Civic is a master developer of large-scale strategic sites. What that means is we take the planning, we put the green, the grey and the community infrastructure in, and then the house builders come and deliver the homes on fully serviced parcels. That means, as you rightly say, Jack, we've been delivering on green infrastructure since we were founded back in 2010, and our early sites were coming forward from 2014-15 onwards. And what's been very interesting is that sort of that concept of green infrastructure has moved from initially amenity and indeed habitat protection into a much wider understanding of the multitude of benefits that green infrastructure delivers on large-scale strategic sites. So biodiversity is one of those elements, carbon sequestration is another, but also health and well-being and general amenity value for the residents. And I think you alluded to it at the beginning, post-lockdown, that is absolutely at the front and centre of people's minds. So we've been measuring biodiversity net gain actually using the Coventry and Warwickshire toolkit since around 2016. And as a business, we set ourselves an internal target of achieving an average of 12% biodiversity net gain across our sites in delivery by 2025. And that's been really useful because what that's meant is that as a business, we have started looking at biodiversity net gain from a strategic rather than a site-by-site perspective, and working with ecology consultants at Planet and BND, we've been developing a biodiversity toolkit, which then seeks to maximize from every element of green infrastructure we are providing that element of biodiversity net gain as part and parcel of it. And I think you can see behind me one of the footpaths at through the nature corridor at our site at Halton, and the element there of not having mown verges but actually allowing the wildflowers to fully encroach. And that's enabled us to actually lift our performance from biodiversity net gain materially over that period of time. And as you move to the new Natural England metric, I think we're going to be having to shift that target up from 12%, and we'll be announcing that at the end of this year, because as we've transitioned from Coventry and Warwickshire to the Natural England toolkit, actually that measures in slightly different ways and awards more value to certain areas, particularly urban areas of a site. And so therefore our values have gone up. So we'll be shifting our corporate targets up. But we can't underestimate the importance with which actually not just biodiversity net gain as a good thing to be doing for the environment, but also in terms of the residents living on our sites and the appreciation of that biodiversity net gain. And you just have to follow a couple of people on Instagram who live on the sites, and you see what they post. And what they post is the nature corridors, the walkways, the green spaces. And what they talk about as a differential are those spaces. So it is not a zero-sum gain in terms of just a cost for the purposes of nature. This is actually an investment in green infrastructure as a whole, and biodiversity net gain is a key component of that.
Thanks, James. Yeah, and I mean, you know, Urban and Civic implementing what you've been doing with biodiversity for such a long time is I guess proof that, you know, you can integrate biodiversity net gain into the planning process from an early stage, and it can work. And actually, James, I remember you saying to me last week that actually it can help you sell houses as well, which is another key component of obviously building houses. So yeah, I mean, do you have any comments on that side of things?
Yeah, no, I mean, I fully agree with that. I mean, that's my comment really about the amenity of place. Admittedly, you know, this comes from the master developer perspective, which is that, you know, there will be on our sites maybe 5,000, 6,000 homes brought forward over a 10, 15, 25-year period. Therefore, the green infrastructure that is being brought forward in the early phases is really then a place maker for the whole development over that extended period of time. And the involvement and maintenance and understanding of the performance of that early green infrastructure is also relevant, because of course it's the front door for the future phases. So you know, it is absolutely right for Natural England and for DEFRA to be encouraging, and now with a stick enforcing biodiversity net gain. But the encouragement from those of us that have been doing it for a while, and perhaps we'll touch on other points around education in due course, is that actually it really does, it is appreciated. It's appreciated both sort of informally, and if you can get people to understand it, formally, as to the way in which they appreciate where they live. So but you've got to start early, and I think that's a key point that's come out, as you rightly say, on a number of speakers. You've got to build this design in. If you try and retrofit it at the last minute, to be quite frank, it's more expensive, it's more painful, and it's going to be difficult to do, and not optimal for nature either. And I think the only other point I would make is that we're talking at the moment within our red line. The local authorities that have just been talking actually are looking at it across a wider area. When we are looking at individual sites, we have to look at how that forms and takes part of wider pathways for nature as well. And so that pure biodiversity metric within the red line is important, but that wider piece is actually what's going to be more sustaining over the longer term.
It makes me so happy to hear you say that, because I think it'd be so easy to just follow blindly the metric and the calculations, but actually that's a canvas on which we can paint a picture, and actually how that is relevant to the local landscape. This is what it's for. This is what biodiversity net gain is for. It's to recover our landscape and recover nature. So you know, that extra thought piece, which is not mandatory, that is best practice, is music to my ears. I'd like to ask the same question to you, Neil. Neil Beamsley, head of biodiversity at Bellway Homes. I know that Bellway haven't been implementing biodiversity net gain, to date, but obviously there are a lot of local authorities requiring no net loss or a net gain in policy. You must have experienced where things have worked and where things haven't worked. Where there's risks and opportunities. Would you like to share any examples?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Jack, and welcome everyone. Yes, I mean, I think from a Bellway point of view, we are very much working towards the mandated 10%. Our policy is very clear in terms of we have an internal sustainability strategy called Better with Bellway. Within Better with Bellway, we've got 8 key pillars, and one of those pillars is biodiversity. So we are aiming as a business to have 10% on all of our developments by midsummer next year. We recognise as a company that there is potentially quite a significant risk in terms of what we do as a house builder presented by BNG, but equally quite a significant gain as well. So we're very clear from the top level down that we're going to be positive on that. We're going to try and drive towards getting that 10% on all of our schemes. I think ultimately we have to be realistic as a house builder as well, is the fact that BNG is a statute, it'll be a standard condition, and therefore it's going to be a standard hurdle to overcome for every one of our schemes. We don't build schemes of a level that they may be an exception that we don't have to deliver BNG upon. So that's something we're having to embrace as a business and making sure we plan thoroughly. At the moment, we're looking at things on a case-by-case basis, depending on the local authority area that we're working within. And at the moment, we're being reasonably successful in terms of having that dialogue with the local authority at the early stage, making sure we're clear on what the constraints are and the requirements are, and how we're actually going to go about delivering that 10% gain for that particular site. Because of that, I think there will be a certain degree of suck it and see, and time will tell as to how this actually rolls out in reality. It is a huge, huge thing. It's a monster BNG. I think people really need to embrace it as soon as possible to make sure that the planning process doesn't grind to a halt. So in terms of lessons learned, I think there's a few things just to flag. I think firstly, it's really important to have a plan. It's really important to understand where you are, where you want to be, and how you're going to get there. It doesn't just happen by magic, and it is going to take a lot of effort from a lot of people and a lot of different disciplines to make sure that BNG can actually be delivered effectively. Equally, it's not cheap. There's going to be a cost associated with BNG, both in terms of procuring land, the actual cost of negotiating those land deals, but equally the management of the land as well. And that's something that we at Bellway are looking at very carefully at the moment, working with various people across the industry to look at how much these things will actually cost to deliver over 30 years, because it's a little bit of an unknown, and it's also quite a significant risk in terms of the viability of schemes and how that's going to work going forward. So that's really, really important for everyone to engage with, to understand that those costs are realistic and they will deliver what we want to deliver in terms of the gain at the end of the day. And I think to echo what James was saying as well, it's really important that the BNG element of any planning application is not a retrofit. It has to be there from the beginning. Trying to find land retrospectively is very, very challenging. And therefore, the more you can do from a very early stage of planning to get that BNG ideally within your red line boundary. But if not, looking at that offsite option, how that's going to work, where it's going to be is really, really important. And I think it's the case of it's not just a piece of land, it's the right piece of land in the right location, delivering the right outcomes for biodiversity, which is another really, really important facet of what we're doing with BNG.
Thanks, Neil. That takes us really nicely onto I guess another aspect of it, which is this retrofitting and how that impacts on viability. And Alex Pelton, Group Biodiversity Manager at Barrett and David Wilson Homes, I believe you've done some I guess groundbreaking for your organisation analysis retrospectively on planning applications to understand what it would have impacted if it was mandatory at that point. And you've had some interesting findings, haven't you?
Yeah, thanks, Jack, and good morning, everybody. So the retrospective assessments that we undertook at Barrett were kind of the first step on our BNG journey. So we did these actually before even Metric 2 came out. So it's kind of we used a precursor to the DEFRA metric. But essentially, it kind of gave us our baseline of what we were already doing and what we then needed to do in future. It's kind of informed everything that we've done subsequently. So we took a kind of representative sample of sites that we had, some small, some large, some greenfield, some brownfield, and ran an assessment on exactly as they were planned. So we didn't want to kind of manufacture a scheme that we thought theoretically might achieve a net gain. So we wanted it very much business as usual. Suffice to say, none of them actually did, or sorry, only one did, and perhaps unsurprisingly, it was a brownfield site. All the other greenfield sites were delivering net losses to varying degrees, generally proportional to their size and scale. But what that helped us to begin doing, at least, was to understand the early application of the mitigation hierarchy and how that would impact what we could actually deliver on site. If we took some of those examples and actually looked at them and reapplied the mitigation hierarchy and thought about them in a BNG context, one or two of them may just have got over the line with no net loss. But effectively, that has kind of it's been crystallized into some early learnings, and we were able to start developing some toolkits and guidance that were Barrett specific, because ultimately we are a house builder, we aren't ecologists, so we had to develop toolkits and guidance that would help key functions, so land planning, our design and technical teams, understand how biodiversity net gain was likely to affect them and the way that they work. And those have evolved over time alongside the metrics and emerging guidance. But we've also had quite a lot of interaction with those divisions, our divisions across the country. And more recently this year, we've been running a series of regional workshops where we've invited our divisions, ecologists, landscape architects and urban design consultants to effectively have a roundtable discussion, ask them what we could be doing better as well. and then kind of showcase what work we've got in the what work we have in the offing before BNG becomes mandatory. 2022 has been quite a busy year actually for a lot of this work, and one key focus, and it's James has highlighted it, is this communication piece with homeowners, with other key stakeholders, because homeowners will essentially be the custodians of these spaces in the long term. So that placemaking piece, that upskilling, that understanding of what we've done, why we've done something is really key. Making sure that we communicate the benefits of biodiverse landscaping to customers has been absolutely fundamental. So it's been, it's still a developing process. We've still got a lot of work to do in that space. Thankfully, we have some really helpful relationships, notably with the RSPB. We have a corporate partnership with them, so they can kind of help us, with strategic work that we've got going on in that space. It's been a journey. We feel better prepared now than we did a few years ago, that's for sure, but there's still a lot of learning to do. So when we've got the final version of the biodiversity metric, and we know a little bit more about the secondary legislation, we can formalise everything that we've done up to this point and pin the strategy down for the next few years to come.
Thanks, Alex. And yeah, sounds like you're in a really good place. You're about as progressed as you can be, and you've said it really. Following the mitigation hierarchy is going to be absolutely critical for this. Biodiversity net gain forces everyone to consider the mitigation hierarchy. It needs to be ecology at the front end of the process. If it's at the back end, people are going to get stung for it, and the environment will eventually suffer. So it's really heartening to hear what Barratt are doing to manage those risks and realise the opportunities, I guess. Just holding on to your point about I guess people being at the heart of the places that you're shaping. Dinny Shaw, I'd like to come to you next, just to understand, Dinny, your strategic land head of planning at St Modwen, and have I got that title right?
Modwen. Yeah.
Sorry,
yeah.
Modwen. Sorry, my apologies. You've done some really great community sort of engagement work relating to green space and biodiversity. The people who are going to be living and breathing these sites, which are being shaped. How's that gone?
Yeah, thank you, Jack. And it's been a really interesting session so far. Lots of fantastic things here, and I completely sort of agree with everything that's being said in terms of the importance of biodiversity again and preparing for this coming into place. At St Modwen Homes, we also act as a master developer role and also are a house builder, and we're delivering new communities across the country, and obviously placemaking, creating better places, creating better futures is a really important part of that. And biodiversity and health and wellbeing and nature is obviously all part of creating those great new places. So one of the key things in terms of biodiversity net gain, we went through a very similar process to Barratt in terms of retrospectively looking at sites, understanding what we would have achieved, and then a lot of lessons learned from that. But one of the key things that has been mentioned is involving the community in delivering biodiversity. It's really important in terms of the engagement, in terms of health and well-being of your communities, bringing people together, and that sort of placemaking, creating better places. One of our sites, Kingsgrove out in Wantage, we were delivering a lot of woodland. We're delivering a lot of woodland there as part of a new development and extension to Wantage, and that's gone in early, but it was all around the edges of the development. No one could get to it. So last year we looked at, well, how can we actually open this space up? Bearing in mind we have 4 different house builders on that site, lots of other infrastructure going in, but how can we open this space up to residents? And we found a way to create path and managed to open that woodland up early to residents at the end of last year. And it's been so successful in terms of placemaking, beginning to demonstrate to residents you're not just going to be living in it's not just a house and there's no sort of infrastructure around. You can actually get to the open spaces around here as well. So that was fantastic. The other point, which has also been touched on, is about sort of informing and educating the community about the spaces around them and why they have been developed, how they've been developed. So James, I think, mentioned, rather than having footpaths with amenity grassland, can you plant these wildflower areas, which don't always look pristine all through the year. And you know, we need to make residents aware that there's a reason why we're not going to have sort of amenity grassland across all the developments. There's real importance here in terms of the biodiversity and the habitats that are being created. And then the community engagement side of it is all really important in terms of promoting the ongoing ownership and stewardship, again, which I think has been mentioned already. I think, as Alex mentioned, these spaces are eventually going to be handed over to management companies and managed by residents. And especially with the importance of a 30-year management plan coming into play in terms of delivering biodiversity net gain, we need to make sure that those people are buying into the areas that have been created and they will continue to deliver them. So we've involved lots of different initiatives over the last couple of years since we established our own biodiversity net gain strategy. At things like, you know, simple things like bulb planting events involving local schools, local communities, and working with local sustainability groups. And we have a site, Branston Lees, where we've delivered a new nature reserve there, working with the local wildlife trust, and have held many events there with the local community and local schools, bringing people together, teaching them about the environment and new habitats, and just, you know, introducing them to these lovely open spaces that are being provided.
Thanks, Denny. It sounds like you're doing that community piece really well, and there's probably quite a lot of lessons to be learned from what you're currently doing. And you know, these places, that people are going to be living there, and there's going to be pressures associated with that. So the habitats, they need to be appropriate for the users, don't they? And you know, you need that communication piece to inspire them to understand it. You know, whether that's through signage or through, you know, communication pieces through the letterbox of the first buyers or whatever it is. And they need to adopt that and take ownership of it, because that's what it's for. 30 years is a really long time. You know, if you think about, you know, 30 years previously, you know, I was a baby, so that was a very long time ago. So I'll just move on now from the community piece to Neil. I just want to understand from you what your biggest concerns are with sort of the delivery of biodiversity net gain in practice, both on site and off site, and how would you see them resolved for whatever problems you see? Do you need to be unmuted, Neil?
Sorry.
Oh, there we are.
Okay.
Sorry.
Thank you. Sorry about that. Yes, I mean, I think like I alluded to before, this is a really big thing. It's something that we really need to engage with in the right way, with the right mindset, in the right timescale. There are a number of things that we have identified as a business that are potential risks that we're working proactively to try and address. And I think, speaking to a lot of people from a lot of different industries, as I do at the moment, first and foremost, there's still quite a lot of misunderstanding about biodiversity net gain. There's a lot of misinformation as well. And I think it's incumbent on everyone who's going to be engaging with this as a subject to really understand what it's about, what the limitations are, what the opportunities are, and what the guidance particularly shows us. Being aware of the metric, understanding how you fill in the metric, understanding how the metric works and what it's actually showing you is really, really important. Understanding the legislation, making sure that you're clear on what the legislation is saying and how that applies to what you're trying to do in terms of BNG. And equally, sort of from our point of view, we're a house builder, we sell houses to people. We need to make sure that that message is getting through to our communities as well, because ultimately we're placemakers, we're community makers. We want people to understand why there's a field next door that has got species-rich grassland in it, or why we're creating woodland in one corner of their scheme. All that kind of thing is very important messaging. And I think, so first in terms of concern is making sure that messaging is getting through to the right people in the right way, so everyone can understand what we're all collectively trying to achieve in terms of biodiversity net gain. Second concern, I think, probably is more to do with the offsite. I think there's an assumption that land will just be there and be available to use for biodiversity net gain. That's just not the case. And I think that there's a lot of work that needs to be done, first and foremost, to make sure that you are delivering as much of your 10% requirement within your red line boundary, looking at your landscaping, working with your colleagues in the landscaping teams, working with the placemakers, working with the master developers to make sure that that land is available, because that ultimately is a really good starting point, and you want to get as much of that 10% as you can within the red line boundary. If you can't, then, to echo what I said earlier, it's making sure that if you identify the need for offsite, you do it in a timely manner, you do it right at the very beginning of the process, and you make sure that you're very clear on what the objectives for that offsite land are. there's a lot of people trying to sell land. There's a lot of people trying to inflate the value of land and things like that at the moment, which is understandable. But equally, you've got to understand what that offsite land is being used for. So understanding the process, understanding that you need to get that front loaded is a very, very important part of what we need to do. And I think that to sort of follow on from that, from a final point I would make, it just in terms of land availability, is that I think we've all seen the stats from DEFRA that I think it's 5,500 hectares or thereabouts required each year for biodiversity net gain, of which about 1,300 will need to be off-site. We're not a big island, and that's a lot of land that's going to be required year on year over that 30 years on into the future. So need to be realistic about that, what that land is developing. I think stacking is going to be absolutely key, and how that the guidance from DEFRA allows stacking. You've got to remember that that land is for BNG, but it's also for food production. It's for nutrient neutrality. It's for carbon offsets. It's for tree planting, peat restoration. All of these things are competing for what is a finite resource of land. So making sure that we plan that use of offsite, not just for BNG, but strategically for all the other things we need, and making sure that's all tied together neatly.
Yeah, well said, Neil. And I think the indication from a conversation I had with DEFRA a few weeks ago is that stacking and bundling is probably going to be allowed. And to me, that makes sense. You know, it's if you can stack and bundle the same ecosystem services on the same piece of land, you will end up delivering sites which are having multiple benefits because they will be cheaper to be able to sell the products of. So it all makes sense. But we'll wait and see what that guidance says. Just a follow on from that, Neil, and Alex, I'd like to ask this similar question to you as well afterwards. But in terms of the actual delivery, do you think we're geared up enough to actually deliver this in practice and actually manage this in practice for the periods that we're talking about?
I think, if I'm honest, not at the moment, no. I think there's a lot of work still to be done, and there's a lot. I think a big part of that is the understanding as to how a BNG is going to work. I think where we are at the moment, a lot of people are kind of living a little bit hand to mouth in terms of each scheme is looking at each scheme and making sure that scheme can deliver. If you're then looking at that for every single scheme you bring forwards from a housing development point of view, that's a very different mindset and a very different shift. So certainly at Bellway, you know, from the top down, we're very much engaging with this at the moment to make sure that everyone across the business understands that this is going to be a fundamental part of our work going forwards, and we need to engage with it as soon as we can.
Sure. Yeah, and it's going to be a complete shift in mindset for people who are managing this land on the ground. You know, for offset providers, farmers, you know, being paid to do less of similar things to what they currently do is probably not that much of a shift for them. But actually managing sites, you know, development sites themselves, and moving away from amenity grassland to something which has the same amenity value but is more diverse and rich, is going to be a shift in mindset. And how you actually achieve that with excellence is going to be key.
I think that's a really good point, and actually, particularly the larger scale land management that will come through for the offsite, people who are managing that land have to be aware that that's set to a certain criteria in terms of what the metric condition assessment says. So there's going to be a difference in terms of just managing land for the sake of it being a nice bit of grassland to managing land to a certain specification that's required by the metric associated with the scheme.
Yeah, definitely. And Alex, what do you have any sort of big concerns from the actual delivery of biodiversity net gain in practice?
I think Neil's covered off a lot of very salient points there. I mean, both carry an element of risk, but albeit kind of different kinds of risk. If we're looking at on-site hole, I mean, at the moment, if you get a LEMP, for example, to discharge a condition, very often they're only for 5 years. So if we're expecting to be managing these habitats on site for a minimum of 30 years, they need to be restructured to allow for that kind of longer term management. It may be that some of those techniques are repeated year on year, but I think that needs to be explicit. Certainly if you have management companies that may change over time, that continuity to that practice needs to happen, should it change. I understand that there was a template sort of management and maintenance report being developed, and I think that'd be a really handy tool so that as developers we can start to have those conversations with landscape architects, ecologists and mancos that might be taking on the management of that site in the long term. Notwithstanding the custodian and long-term stewardship piece that we've discussed about on site, if we're talking about off-site delivery, I think the main concern is probably that so I've got a fire alarm going off. 1 second. It's just a test. Apologies for that. So if we're talking about off-site delivery, legacy, long-term management, again, is a really important thing. We're doing quite a lot of work in this space at the moment in terms of due diligence of offset partners, who they might be, what that might look like, because the last thing we want to do is put money in the hands of people who may not actually be able to deliver what we want them to deliver or need them to deliver to achieve BNG. So there's a reputational piece to be thinking about there too, about choosing the right individuals. Neil touched on skills and capacity, and that's a really important point. I think a lot of management companies at present, not all, but some, have been used to doing traditional, shall we say, landscape management. We might need to move more towards habitat management, which might require some upskilling, might require investment into new equipment that previously hasn't been required on a residential development, for example. So training courses in that regard, I think Nick had mentioned some things around the Field Studies Council. All of those things would be really useful for the wider industry, but partnerships as well. We benefit enormously from our partnership with the RSPB. They also have a partnership with ID Verde, who do a lot of public sector land management. So relying on people, organisations that have got some conservation and habitat management knowledge to help you in your own work it can only be a good thing for all.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. And you've touched on quite a few points which sort of resonate with me, really. And I guess one of them is around the risk and liability of offset providers, and whether they are actually going to deliver what they say they're going to deliver. Because, like I said, 30 years is a really long time, and no disrespect to nature conservation organisations who have well meanings, but I used to, in Natural England, monitor countryside stewardship and agri-environment schemes. And NGOs, the conservation organisations, don't always deliver what they're meant to deliver in the agreement, and that's only a 5-year agreement. So what hope do everyone else have if the conservation organisations can't even deliver what's in the management plan? So I think there's a bit of thought needs to go into actually how local authorities keep control over that period, and I think there's a financial element of this where, and it's been tried and tested in other parts of the country with local authorities to do with habitat regulations. How do we secure the minimum amount of funding needed to deliver the scheme, which will be secured, so that the landowner doesn't go and buy a load of Range Rovers or an island in the Caribbean and just gift it to their least favourite child to deliver without any funding. I think that's a real risk, and I don't want to tarnish all farmers and offset providers with the same brush, but that's a risk we need to think about, because there probably will be some people who, well, now I've mentioned it, probably will do it because I've mentioned it, but we need to think about it. I think that's the key bit. So Damien, I'm sorry, I haven't come to you yet with any of the questions, but I'd like to come to you next if that's okay. Yeah, Damien, you're strategic land head of planning. Oh no, sorry, you're not. What am I have lost your title. Would you mind just explaining where you work and where you're
sure
from?
I'm a senior planning manager for Sigma Strategic Land, which is part of the Sigma Homes group based in Horsham. So yeah, we look at strategic land opportunities, but we also got that house building experience as well. Just really resonate with what the panel's been saying, really, especially in terms of what Neil was saying about time to bed in with the secondary legislation. I think that's really important. I also think as well that there does need to be community buy-in if it's to be successful over those sorts of timescales. That is very, very long indeed. And if it's the case of on-site mitigation, then maybe it could be in the case of a housing scheme that local residents can somehow maintain it or enhance areas such as wildflower meadows or ponds. But really what I wanted to talk to you today was a slightly different mindset. I mean, it's great if we can bake it in early doors, but where you have historic land interests, it's an altogether different proposition. And just to take you on a very brief journey of one of our sites, which is 6 acres on the edge of Sevenoaks town, and it's your sort of typical site. It's a green field with a single pond. It's got hedgerows, trees bordering around it. And our proposal is for 50 homes with a generous area of open space to the southwest, all fairly normal, you would have thought. We sent the ecologists out to do their typical ecology surveys, and also the BNG metric. And to our surprise, what came back was an analysis of semi-improved grassland, which has quite a high level of ecological distinctiveness. So we were facing down the barrel of a BNG score of around -50 or 14 biodiversity units, all due to the grassland. So we thought, what are we going to do? Well, first of all, we looked at onset BNG because that's part of the mitigation strategy. And the hierarchy, but it was very clear that even if we were to improve the grassland, put bat boxes in, try to protect and enhance wherever we could the pond, it just wasn't going to be enough. We weren't going to get to net gain. Then we obviously turned to off-site options, and being a developer and you know, we have a lot of land contacts, we could have approached them and tried to forge our own way. But that wasn't a very well-trailed path. It would have led to quite a lot of protracted negotiations with landowners. So we reached out to the Kent Wildlife Trust, and here we found a very engaging statutory body with a reputation as guardians of environmental stewardship, and they produced a very, very clear roadmap for us. First of all, they screened our metric, so that was basically objective analysis of what we'd produced, and then they undertook a land search, and they found us a compensatory site which was within 10 kilometres away. As you can imagine, we were delighted and very much relieved. So on this compensatory land, there is going to be, it's from replacement grassland habitat to restored neutral grassland. There's areas of blackthorn that's going to be enhanced. There's going to be woodland creation and some ponds as well. And what's really neat is that, as per the sort of the Lawson principles to expand, buffer and connect areas within the wider network, it's going to be working closely with the Kent Nature Partnership. So it's not just going to be an isolated compensatory land, it's going to be something of a wider network as well. So that's purely a strategic proposition that's really quite exciting. In terms of how it's going to work, well, it's going to be a Section 106 that we're going to enter into with Kent Wildlife Trust, and a conservation covenant as well, with a detailed management plan. The landowner does retain possession of the land at all time and is responsible for overseeing the enhancements, and it's Kent Wildlife Trust's job to monitor and report back effectively. I think it's fair to say that it's been an interesting journey, one that hasn't actually been completed. We're still in the process of going to the LPA to agree that this is something that's appropriate, but we are mindful of betterment and additionality positions. But I would encourage all of the listeners that tuned in today to look at Wildlife Trust, because in them we are really excited about creating a new relationship, new partnerships, which really wouldn't have been the case had it not been for BNG.
Thanks, Damien. Yeah, really great to hear, insight into something in practice, and how do you deliver these with a responsible partner who will deliver them with certainty. The Wildlife Trust are renowned for being commercially savvy, and expanding their network, which is paid for by offsetting, especially in the south, it seems. So yeah, I mean, great partnership and great advice, which I'm sure a lot of people will take away from this. Just one last very quick question for you, Damien, as well. As a senior town planner, delivery of environmental outcomes through the planning process has sort of had bad press in the past due to non-delivery and lack of enforcement. So from a planning perspective, do you think there's any mechanisms available to secure biodiversity net gain on-site and off-site which are robust enough to deliver what's being proposed?
It was a really interesting question. I think time will tell. Like Neil was saying, I think that Section 106 and conservation covenants will certainly get us there. I think that is a very tight arrangement. I do think that there probably needs to be more work around strategic offsite solutions and the national database and tying it all up, so we have something that does hang together. You can enforce, you can monitor over timescales that really hitherto, haven't really been trialled. It will be very interesting. It's certainly beyond most people's sort of careers. If they're very young in local government, it will be when they retire that this thing still continues. So over those sorts of timescales, it will be a challenge. But I think that it's only through regular monitoring, reporting back, and something like a wildlife trust where you've got that long-term commitment, that sort of thing can actually pay off, and we have some comfort that there is environmental stewardship really at its heart. And I think, as I think I've touched on it before, but I think with off-site that's going to be harder because it's physically divorced, whereas on-site you can see it, you can manage it, the residents can look out over it and report back if necessary.
Yeah, I mean, they certainly have different risks associated with them, both on-site and off-site. Yeah, and like you say, I think the buzzword at the moment, well, it's certainly in Natural England and DEFRA, is adaptable management. And it was mentioned before about the sort of template habitat management and monitoring report, which is being provided by Natural England, which I was actually part of the creation of as a tender. I believe that's going to be published. I'm not exactly sure when, but it will be published, I hear. And I think that will give a really good indication of actually how on paper this is secured, and how that adaptable element at the sort of back end in the prescriptions feeds back to what we're actually trying to achieve. What are the overarching objectives, what we're trying to achieve, and then you can modify them. If there's public pressure which is impacting on a condition criteria, or a certain distinctiveness type was not achieved because something wasn't done and it needs to be rectified. All those adaptable approaches, which are cyclical and feed back to each other, I think is really critical, and that template I think does provide that. So eagerly await that as well. I think we probably ought to wrap it up now. We've heard from Natural England themselves about an update for the next 12 months. We've had insight into local planning authorities and how they're grappling with readying themselves for mandatory biodiversity net gain. And it's been a really, really interesting conversation with all of you developers, or representing developers on the approaches that you're taking and how you're readying yourself from the implementation stage. So I just want to thank everyone for being a panelist today, and sharing your insights into your company. If anyone who's watching this wants to continue and engage directly with either myself or with the panelists, you were sent an email, I believe, which has a link to a page on LinkedIn, which you can comment on. I will be available for the next sort of 30 minutes to an hour to respond to questions, and I hope that there will be some of the panelists which will be available to respond to those questions as well. If people don't end up having a direct response, I will probably forward that question on directly to the person it's aimed at, and then they can get back in touch with you. So thank you very much for everyone joining today, and I think we'll wrap it up there. Thanks all. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.